Okay, well, we are ready to start the second of 4 sessions. We've got a couple more folks wandering in, so I'll stretch a little bit. Second of 4 sessions on this spring lecture series on the Beatitudes. And as a reminder, this series, this 4-part series, is part of a bigger group of lectures. So last spring we looked at the Nicene Creed. The idea there was that in traditional catechisms, the creed is presented as embodying the virtue of faith and providing essentially a summary of what we believe. If you're a Christian, what do you believe? And it's summarized in the creed. And then in the fall, we did the series on the Lord's Prayer, and the Christian virtue that was highlighted there was hope, in that as followers of Jesus Christ, part of what we do and part of the hope that we derive in our faith is through prayer, and the embodiment and the perfect prayer that we are given is the Lord's Prayer. And so love, the third big virtue that we're looking at, is actually going to be is this lecture series on the Beatitudes, and in the fall I'll be doing a lecture series on the 10 Commandments. But those 4 pieces really are the content of a traditional Orthodox catechism. And because they are nice touchstone texts to look at, I thought it would be a good thing to work through those. So that's kind of the recap. Last time we looked at the first 2 Beatitudes. As I've been doing in these sessions, I'll just read the entirety of the Beatitudes to restart where we are. And then we'll move into what the topics are for tonight. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. So just summarizing again, the Beatitudes are presented in the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the major extended teachings that Jesus Christ does in the Gospels. And it's specifically in the Gospel according to Matthew. So the entire Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. And he begins with this. I mean, it's just kind of like the crowd gathers, everybody's there, and it says Jesus opens his mouth and says this. So he leads with the Beatitudes. Okay, so quick summary of where we've been. As I highlighted the Beatitudes, there are 9 in particular. And so each session we'll look at 2. The last one we'll look at 3, because the last 3 are related to one another. So if you do the math there, 2 and 2 and 2 and 3 get you to 9. So last time we looked at the first 2. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the idea that we looked at there, this idea of poor in spirit, we had the synonym of humble. And it's this idea of recognizing our spiritual shortcomings and saying that if we start from that position, we actually inherit the kingdom of heaven with that realistic sense of who we are. And I'll come back to that a little bit because that relates to where we're going. And then Beatitude 2, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And this more specifically talks about mourning in the sense of the fallen world, a general sense, and then more specifically our own personal fallenness. We mourn our shortcomings because we're fallen people and our propensity to sin. But it says that if we mourn, we're actually comforted in that process. We're not just left to despair. And I think that is something that sometimes can happen with people is if they go too far down the road of sinfulness and there's no message of hope, then they'll just, I'm a terrible sinner. I can do no right. I never get it right. And it kind of leads to this, what's the point, might be the question. And kind of the point is coming back and saying, well, it's good that you mourn those things, but you can work on them, and you will be comforted, and you don't do those alone. So, first two Beatitudes. So tonight, transition, we'll look at the third and fourth Beatitudes. So, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We'll get to that momentarily. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. So, I know that the language of these can lead us in certain directions, and that's the case with both of these Beatitudes. We hear the word meek, and I think our tendency is we equate meek with timid and passive. And so it's kind of like be timid and passive. But a better way of framing this is in terms of being gentle or dispassionate. And that's kind of a more technical word there. So it relates some to the first Beatitude. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, and this idea of humility. So the issue with the first Beatitude is pride. And saying, well, if you have pride, you're not poor in spirit. That has to do with your self-concept. So if you have the spirit of pride, you're not poor in spirit. You're kind of functioning a particular way. When we talk about being gentle or dispassionate, that has more to do with how you interact with the people around you and the world. So it's saying be gentle, be dispassionate. And of course, the most troublesome thing is, it's kind of a trope for me in a lot of my homilies. When you walk out the doors here, you're dealing with something completely different. I have a way of framing that. The commerce of our contemporary world is very much one of passions. Anger, jealousy, satisfaction. We're actively encouraged to, quote unquote, stand up for ourselves. Always. Don't be a doormat. And so we have that picture of the world where we have to do all of these things. And we get stirred up. Our passions, as it were. Anger, I kind of list them off. Anger, jealousy. We get worked up about things when we're out in the world. And the people around us get worked up about things. And we can think of very mundane as well as very high-level examples of all of that. I know that a lot of our high-level stuff, the fear and trembling I have is this is an election year. And we're at the point in our society where, and I think we recognize this, our whole political approach today in our country is polarized. And it's not so much about, historically you'd have a two-party system with traditional, one party would have a certain set of values of how they would approach things, the other party would have a certain set of how they would evaluate things. And part of the political process was, there was an element of compromise. And while we have differing ideologies on how we approach this, but there's still this commitment of civility and doing what's best. And I think we're very much at this point where it's point on, and they talk about, the aisles and all of that. You can point to either side of the aisle, as it were, politically, and those guys are the bad guys, and they're terrible people. And it's even getting to the point where we're not even talking about them as people. It's just those people are horrible. Even kind of this notion of subhuman. That's all out there, and we go out and we get wrapped up in that, and that's kind of a thing that can stir our pots. But that's still high level. We also have our day to day, and so some of the basic things that we tend to run into is we drive cars, and other people drive cars, and a common thing is we'll get in our car and we'll get on the road, and someone will do something and we get angry about that, or we will have people that come up on us and get angry at us. Something I do not like doing is coming to church because of the street here. I love it when I'm at church. I love it when I'm here. But to get here, there can be issues. And it's kind of a funny thing. 306, the speed limit's 45. And people want to just keep going. And I will do this thing where very far back, I will turn on my turn signal and I will slow down to turn, and it's a right angle, so I can't come barreling down at 45 and just kind of flip the wheel. But I occasionally have people who are right on my bumper and they will start honking at me, even though I've signaled with plenty of notice and I've slowed down with plenty of notice. I think it's somehow in their head this driveway doesn't exist, and they think I'm turning somewhere else further down the road here, and they're upset because I'm turning when they didn't want me to turn. But that's one. And so I could respond to that in certain ways. Probably don't want to shake my fist and do any gestures out my window because I'm pulling into a church parking lot, and and if they look closely, they kind of get an idea of who I am at this church. But still, that is a temptation that we have. And it's actually surprising. I will have, in confession, people saying, things of that nature. I was driving and I got mad at somebody and did A, B, and C. Passion, anger, jealousy. Very common thing that we have. We also have kind of this phenomena where I think we can agree that the standards we may have had when we were younger or even as children for customer service were very different, and that in a lot of instances you can look at companies and they do a very good job of putting on a performance of customer service. But in terms of helping you, there are businesses that, we're sorry. I'm sorry you feel bad. I'm sorry you feel that way about your terrible customer service experience, and I apologize you feel bad, sort of thing. And we can get frustrated. But I think that has also amped up. And so we have this experience. And we have this popular culture idea of the Karen, as you hear. Someone's, a woman is being a Karen because they're, I want to speak to the manager. This was not done properly. How dare you, sort of thing. Not to be chauvinistic about this. Popular culture, if you weren't aware, also came up with the term for men. Darrens, I guess it's Karen and Darren, just because it rhymes. Same sort of thing. Men who are getting upset about some sort of customer service experience and complaining. And often it's at a degree far higher than what actually happened. And kind of in all of this, we put a layer on it too. You go on YouTube and you can look this stuff up. So people having road rage stuff, and somebody's there filming it, and they put it on YouTube. So you can vicariously participate in these things. Well, look how terrible that person was. They cut this other person off, and shame on them. There's even a phenomenon a little step further on that. Instant karma videos. So someone will film, oh, this guy's being a jerk, and he pulled in front of somebody, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere comes a highway patrol car, and they get pulled over. So it's kind of like, serves you right, you were being a jerk, and the cops got you, sort of thing. All get worked up about those sorts of things. So this is saying, don't do that, and don't engage in that. Be gentle, be dispassionate. And it does go to a root level of conflicting value here. Because, of course, all of that message really does go to what matters, what is important, and what, at the end of the day, works is looking out for number one. So it is this value of, you got to stand up for yourself. And if you don't, you're going to lose in the end, as it were. Well, the point that is made, those people don't inherit the earth. It's just drama, trauma, and more drama and more trauma. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And this points at a much more important value, and one that we don't necessarily always keep in mind. I'll come back to that in a second. There's the practicality here. I wanted to cover the practicality here. So you are driving around, somebody cuts you off, you yell things at them, you make gestures. End of the day, what do you gain from that? You have a customer service interaction, you get upset, you yell at somebody. What do you gain by that? Political life, I guess the furthest I would go is please vote. I mean, that's kind of the nature of our country, and but I would stop short and say, don't run for office. So, but at the end of the day, where does that get it? Like the whole debating about politics stuff or obsessing about it. I regularly tell parishioners, if you have a thing of watching cable TV news, stop. Because cable TV news is designed to keep you on there to generate revenue for their advertisers. And so it's a very different thing. I make the point of back when I was young, 1970s, before we had nonstop 24-hour cable network news, it's like 6 o'clock at night, you turn on the TV, very nice Walter Cronkite, news anchor, national news, would be there for a half hour and say, this is what's happening in the world. And then at the end of the program, he'd say, see you tomorrow, basically. And anything that was important for you to know, he would present in that. And it's interesting, I came across something in the last year where early 70s, when we were having the controversy in our country about President Nixon, Watergate, and all of the hearings, and a lot of people getting in trouble, and him having to step down, and Ford having to pardon him, and all of that. That at one point the network wanted him to comment, like do a sit down and talk about, kind of like, here's my commentary on what's happening. And he very reluctantly did that. And he made a point. And he said, I am a journalist and I report news. I am not a commentator. And kind of thinking on the model of, you can go to like a print newspaper. Well, you have the front page, that's news. And then you can go inside and there's the opinion page. And he was worried about, people know me as the front page guy, so to speak, on the network, with the network news. Do I want to be the opinion page guy on the network? And that those were two different things. So, a practicality there. What does it get you by embracing the passions of the world. And I think if we pause and think about it, we really don't. So it goes back to this thing of, as I said, competing values. And so we tend to have this value where we think that being forceful and passionate gets you somewhere, and that you do inherit the earth through that activity. And we say no. We ask the question, who's actually in charge? Big scheme about all of these sorts of things. Kingdom of the world is fallen. And so these sorts of influences are how to traffic in a fallen world. But we are part of the kingdom of heaven, which is of God and is given to us from God. And that's where our inheritance lies. And it goes to this it's interesting, I have this book I've been reading. Title of the book, Jesus Christ is Lord. And the entire topic of the book is talking about the lordship of Jesus Christ and what that means and how that permeates different spheres. And part of what's made by the point that's made by that is that one of our early, if you want to call it, creedal statements as Christians was just that. Jesus Christ is Lord. He's the one who's in charge of everything. And so if you're following a leader, do we have divided loyalties, or do we follow the true leader? And it's saying, well, if he's the true leader and he ultimately has power over all of these things, and I think we see that, then we should follow him. And he basically says, you will be taken care of if you follow me in this regard. I guess a point to look at here, and this kind of goes to the political piece as well. I know that through history, the church has had very different relationships with the state, depending upon where it was historically. So of course, if you're looking New Testament, first 3 centuries, the church functioned within the Roman Empire and was basically at odds. Actually was reading something else this evening. If you notice, there is language in the New Testament about Jesus Christ being king, but and primarily in the Gospels, but as we get into the letters, which were written after his ascension into heaven, and as the church is functioning in this historical context of the Roman Empire and it's spreading, the language gets away from that. And instead it emphasizes this language of lordship. And part of that was, how do we function when we're being persecuted? And if we're so overt about, well, of course Jesus Christ is king, then that gives more ammo for the Roman Empire powers that be to come after us and say, well, some of these things that came up when Christ was tried and crucified. Do you say you're a king? Well, are these people following a different king? Well, there's, the only king is Caesar, that sort of thing. So kind of the crux of that. Oh, and I guess the other thing that, kind of the contrast is, of course, the church became the religion of the state. And so there was this thing, you can look Byzantine Empire, the double-headed eagle. One heads the state, one heads the church. This concept of symphonia, where the church is acting with the state and they kind of function in concert. And then we can look at early, 1900s when the communists took over Russia. And I think numerically they figured out that probably the most people who have died historically because of a government persecution was the faithful under communism in Russia. And there are statistics about the state of the church pre-revolution, so number of churches, cathedrals, clergy, monasteries, schools, charitable entities, and up until the beginning of World War II. And kind of the key thing is in World War II, Stalin kind of eased up on the church to keep the people encouraged so that they could fight the Nazis and keep from being overrun here. But there was still, heavy suppression and heavy control there. And then, we can go from there. So there is kind of this thing about where the church lands with the state, and so I don't think there's any one. Well, of course, this is the political theory that goes along with the church. I think it comes back to this: Jesus Christ is Lord, and how and where we live that out can be different depending on where we are and what time in history we are. And ultimately, it's how faithful we are to following Jesus Christ. So, to wrap up this, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Just have this reflection questions. Do I tell others what decisions to make and how to think or act because I believe I know best at home, school, work, or wherever I may be? If people do not take my advice, do I experience feelings of hatred, revenge, or resentment, being unwilling to forgive? Do I abuse or insult others? Do I practice the Lord's commandment in Luke 6:27? Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. So that really is a question to look at in terms of how am I interacting with the world? Am I attempting to approach this in terms of gentleness and dispassionateness? Or am I getting all stirred up and having to beat the drum there on going after people? So, all right, brief pause. I'm going to get a little water. We'll move into the next Beatitude. And I always ask if there are questions or comments before we move on to the next Beatitude. Happy to entertain those.
What does the part mean about inherit the earth?
It's basically saying that the worldly promise of inheriting the earth by engaging our passions doesn't work. And in terms of, it's basically overcoming that. So it's saying we inherit the earth by, it's kind of a contrast. We inherit the earth by overcoming it, by following Christ. And so anything that matters in this worldly existence, we still inherit that. But the more important thing is the heavenly kingdom. But because people are dealing with that, it's like, well, how do I get ahead? It's just giving them the message. You don't get ahead by doing all of this dastardly stuff out there. You do it by following Christ and putting the priority on the kingdom of heaven. So. All right. Well, let's move on to the next Beatitude, the fourth one. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. And I think this is another one where our common experience is to get stuck on this word righteousness and take it in a direction that's not intended here. I think we'll often hear the phrase righteous indignation. So kind of this correct way of, legitimate way of being angry about something. And I think that kind of stands in contrast to what we just heard about being gentle. And so it kind of takes on this tone of, I'm fighting for justice somehow, and there's an element of anger involved. And that's not the sense that the word is being used. So if we look at where do we hear the word righteous being used within the context of our faith? Often almost exclusively it's used in terms of saints, and specifically Old Testament saints. And an example that we have, a really good one, is we had this feast a week ago, the feast of the presentation of our Lord. So the story there is 40 days after Christmas, being good Jewish people, and Jesus being the first son of the family, and according to the law, he's presented at the temple. He's offered there. He's presented. And we're told that the one who receives him is this older man, Simeon. And of course, part of Simeon's story is that he was told by God that before you die, you will actually meet the Messiah, the Savior of the world. But his title is Righteous Simeon because he's a holy man. And that's been kind of his focus of his whole life, is like living around the temple, waiting for the coming of this Messiah, and preparing for that. And we'll find that in other instances in the Old Testament where Old Testament figures are referred to as righteous so-and-so. So it is, the synonym would be holiness. So it's saying, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for holiness, would be a way of reading that. For they shall be filled. So our last session, I spoke of the Beatitudes being essentially rules for the rubber hitting the road, as it were. So the contrast that we had was, well, we recite the creed. That tells us what we believe about our faith. We say the Lord's Prayer because that is the model of how to pray. But these ideas of love, I said faith, hope, love. Love in terms of the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments are the directions on how are we supposed to act. And the image that I offered was that in our church here, and you see this in a lot of Orthodox churches, you have the icons surrounding the people in the nave of the church. And the point that I make there is, it's not the creepy thing of it, they're watching you. They are watching you. But the idea is that you are standing in the midst of them. And so the idea is that the saints, and of course that's the language of the early church. We'll see, like in Paul's letters, Paul, an apostle, and he kind of gives his resume there. And that's kind of the opening of his letter. And he says, to the saints in the church of, and he'll name the place. So it's saying that the rank and file people in the church are saints. Of course, we have this contemporary thing of, we all know that the real saints are the ones that are actually up on the wall, and icons were made of them, and we very much recognize their holiness in that regard. That's kind of off the hook, getting off the hook sort of language. Well, they're the real saints. We're just kind of here attending church. It does go back to what I was saying. We stand in their midst, and the understanding is that our goal through all of this is that we should end up on the wall at some point. Each and every one of us should have the sense that we may not make it there, but ideally we would become a saint of some sort in the church sense, and an icon of us would be on the wall there. Holiness, that tends to be the word that we use, is that we want to become holy. So it's saying that part of our motivation in our life as Christians, we should be hungering and thirsting to become holy. I want to be like that saint. I know that one of the things that is common with reading the lives of saints is they inspire us. We'll read that story and we'll see there's something there that I wish I had, and I wish I could be that way. This past fall, I'll give you a good example. It's a great book. It came out this past fall. Holy Trinity Publications. That's the monastery, the Russian Orthodox monastery in Jordanville. They have a publishing house. Book is called Glorified in America. So we had this period, late 1800s, early to mid 1900s, And this is the whole thing of that was the time when all these folks from historically Orthodox countries were immigrating here to the U.S. and trying to figure out how to do church. And so there were all of these leaders that were part of that. A lot of them were bishops, some were priests, but that's kind of the big thrust there. And the book gives their lives, and kind of the amazing thing about that, and I know this is a tripping point that I'll have. If you're talking about a saint from the 3rd century, you have a life of that saint, and you kind of have a sense of who they are, but it's a very short life, and that it's not a fuller picture, as it were. I know as 21st century people, we're much more tuned into like biography and more detail. And so that's what's in this book. And so, I mean, kind of the interesting thing is in that book, one is St. John of San Francisco, the second from the back there. He reposed in the 1960s, very contemporary in that respect. Or if you go up here, so third from the front, St. Raphael of Brooklyn, he reposed in 1915. But it's the sort of thing where people told stories, there was oral history, there were newspaper accounts, there was actually physical documentation, so you have very good pictures on who these people were and the sorts of things that they did. I'll just give an interesting side story here. When St. Raphael reposed, of course they had the funeral at St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City, Brooklyn. And the priest who was there, his name was Jacob Kerbowie. Do we know anyone named Kerbowie in this parish? That's one of Isaac Kerbowie. He's a parishioner here. It's like his great-great-grandfather or uncle or something. So that was one of the things he was just like, oh, by the way, Father, I'm related to this guy. And I'm like, that's a guy who's actually connected with a saint. And it's just really interesting with that. So that's kind of a long excursus. We should hunger and thirst for holiness. This kind of relates to some of the things that we saw in those first Beatitudes. So we looked at the idea of poor in spirit. So we start from a place where we recognize our sinfulness and our limitations as fallen people. But we don't stop there. What do we get if we're poor in spirit? The kingdom of heaven. We're told that. We start with that. I can't do this on my own. I can't figure this out on my own. I cannot, by my own powers, overcome this on my own. And that it involves working with Christ. And so that's a picture that we have going into this. It's not about, and the difficulty that we can get in with that perspective, and we can encounter that in the life of the church. I just need to try harder. If we exclude Christ, if we exclude the sacraments of the church, the advice of the clergy, the support of our fellow parishioners, it's just, I'll try harder. And you roll up your sleeves and just kind of grit your teeth. And I'll, the term that I will use and talk about with that is you just want to freelance. You want to do it on your own. You don't want to do it as a part of something where you will be supported. But we have this promise here. If we have this idea of being poor in spirit and lack, and if we accept that the way and the means of addressing that is through our life in the church, then we will be filled. And it really is, because I know that we can get stuck on this thing. There's no way I can be holy like these people. And so why bother? There's probably an element of humility of saying, they did some amazing things. I'm not sure if I will ever reach that point, but the motive and the goal for me is to do as much as possible to be like them And of course, that with God all things are possible sort of thing. And then the promise we're being given here is, well, you will be filled in that. If you authentically are approaching holiness and hungering and thirsting for it, God will support you in that, and you will be brought along with that. So, that's Beatitude 4. I have two reflection questions here to kind of wrap up this part of the presentation. And these can be difficult ones to follow because we like to do all sorts of other things. So the first one, do I put my desire to serve and please the Lord God above all else in my life? It's the priority question. Is following God alone my priority, and everything else falling under that? And then the second question, is my life centered on Christ through prayer, Bible study, fasting, confession, receiving the Eucharist, and in loving and helping others, beginning with family and other Christians and extending to the world? So this even, I didn't speak on this, but it also takes on, it's not just about praying and doing stuff with yourself, but there's a moral dimension and a social dimension. Part of working out your faith as a Christian and your holiness involves helping others. I'm going to do a little excursus here because that comes to mind here. Another favorite saint here. So if we go second from the back, that is Saint Elizabeth, the new martyr. And so she was part of the royal family of Russia. She actually was German, grew up in Germany, and as often happens with royalty, you marry, you're match made with other people. So she married I want to say the Tsar's brother. I have to look at the tree there. And so when she married the Tsar's brother, she converted to the Orthodox Church. And with the turmoil that led up to the revolution in Russia, he was actually assassinated. I think this is like 1905, so probably a good decade before things really got going there in terms of the communist revolution. One of her first requests after finding out that her husband died, she wanted to meet the man who put the bomb in his car. And of course he was, stark raving communist, we have to get rid of the royal family, kind of ranting and raving. And she told him she forgave him. And then where she went from that is, of course, royal family, possessions, finances. She took her wealth, sold it, established a monastery for women. And this is a little different. We tend to think of monastery, you build this thing out in the woods and you just kind of go there and you disappear. Their whole thing was they were in the city. And her and the sisters with her, they were a medical monastery. So they were nurses, and they would go out and they would go to hospitals and they would care for people. The end of her story is her and one of her monastics were captured by the communists. So of course this is during 1917, 1918 when that's all burning down. And so about the same time that the Tsar's family was taken and assassinated, within a matter of days, her and this other monastic and some other kind of mid-level officials in the Tsar's government were thrown into a mine shaft. And then the soldiers who were there threw grenades down in the mine shaft. And then a few weeks later, there were pro-Tsarist soldiers who came through, and they came to recover the bodies. And when they went into the mine shaft, they discovered that not everyone died as a result of being thrown down there and the grenades, including her. And what she did was she attended to the wounded. They could tell that she had crawled over to people who had been wounded and tried to, bandage them and give them comfort. So there's that element. Holiness through prayer and working on yourself, but also holiness through expressing Christ's love to others. I worked in the icons. That's kind of a nice thing. So that's what I have, these two Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. So at this time, if there are questions or points for conversation, we'll open it up for that at this point. I'll get a little water here. All right, anything come to mind? Yes?
I did some reading, and it said that the Beatitudes are used in the liturgy. It's the third antiphon, just before the small entrance.
Mm-hmm.
But it also said it's in the Slavic Orthodox churches, and it didn't mention any of the others. But aren't the Beatitudes used in all the Orthodox churches during the divine liturgy?
No.
Okay, that's all right.
So clarifying. Within Orthodox churches, there are two broad liturgical traditions. So one Slavic and one Byzantine. So, for example, St. Vladimir's Slavic tradition,
Right.
third antiphon is the Beatitudes. St. Luke's Antiochian Byzantine liturgical tradition. So the third antiphon here, right before the little entrance, is, I call it the hymn of the day. So, the terms we have are tropar, troparian.
Yeah.
So whatever, on Sunday, if it's, it would be the troparian of the resurrection for that Sunday. And so that is a difference. What's interesting is, I'm going to misquote this. We do use the Beatitudes during Holy Week. And I'm getting rusty on which service. So it's either the 12 Gospels. I think it is the 12 Gospels. So that, the 12 Gospel service is, we read all of the Gospels having to do with, Last Supper, Christ's betrayal, the trial, crucifixion.
I don't recall it being in there.
I think it's so that's the thing. If it is there, it's after, because part of that is when we tell the story of Christ being put on the cross. There's the big thing of we bring the cross out and we put it here, and there's an icon of Christ being crucified that's put on it. So it's either after that in that service, or it's Friday night at the Lamentations. I could look it up, but I don't want to belabor that. We have Holy Week books in the Chandler stand, but that's where we get it. So it's this very, it coincides with something after the death of Christ, but before the resurrection story on Pascha. So again, kind of emphasizing, these are the rules of the kingdom, and that's actually being fulfilled through his death. We're waiting for the resurrection, but it's in process there. Yeah. But that's a liturgical difference. Yeah. Other questions or comments? I want to think that's the penultimate question. There's an ultimate one coming here. So I'll pose this question. It's a good question. We didn't get an answer last time, but is there anything new or unique that you had not heard before in tonight's presentation?
The concept of righteousness is holiness, because I would have said it was almost the opposite of the first thing. Like, you feel like you're very righteous when you're making a good point or fighting a fight, but to think of it, which is kind of the opposite of being meek or gentle. Yeah. But then it's totally different to think of it as holiness. So that's new.
As pull the curtain back here, I don't always remember things I've learned, things I've looked at. And so it will be things like that. Oh, and I'll read the text. And so I'll say, blessed are the meek, blessed are the righteous. And when I read that, I'm like, how does that work? And it was in preparing and sitting down and parsing out and saying, oh yeah, this is what's going on here. And yeah, forgot about that. But that's the thing, because in that framing, it's consistent. Yes, of course, be meek, and yes, of course, pursue holiness. It's not about being timid and then, getting mad. I have righteous indignation here. Yeah. All right. Is there one almost on the lips there, Raymond? Or
it seems in the phrasing of that beatitude that in the previous ones it's saying, "Blessed are those who are meek." So it's something that they are, but in the one that's relating to righteousness, the thing that they have is the hunger, and then what is bestowed upon them is righteousness. It's not that it's blessed are the righteous.
correct.
And this idea in some of the passages in the scripture where it says that there were those who lived within the commandments of God, and they're described as blameless, but that seems like a little bit different than righteous. So someone can be blameless in their actions if they're following commandments, but that doesn't make them righteous in and of itself. That's something that's given to them.
Yeah, and probably a good example that occurs to me, and we'll be getting to this in a couple of weeks, the publican and the Pharisee. So, it's the two men come into church. Of course, the Pharisee's the religious official. And I'll even point out what he's doing. He's behaving in a good way, but in terms of what's in his heart and the motivation for it, it's all just kind of, I've even said this, he's not really praying to God. He's just standing up in the temple and having a monologue with himself, saying, look how great I am. So he might be doing good things, but his heart and his orientation is not really towards God. Contrasted with the publican, the tax collector, who's just like, I do bad things and I'm a terrible person, like recognizing what I'm doing is bad and there needs to be a course correct here. And so, Jesus saying, well, that one has the right idea because he's honestly looking at where he is and what he needs to do, whereas the Pharisee thinks he's doing everything, probably in the spirit of he's blameless, but is he really righteous? Yeah. So, where are we? A few more minutes, but I won't belabor it if there's nothing else. Okay. So we'll wrap up for tonight. Looking ahead, the next two that we'll look at in 2 weeks. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So that's what we have. Thank you again for coming out, and have a good evening.